All right, guys, so right now, these are my 3 favorite wide-angle lenses from Sony, and they cost between $800 and over $2,000, and they all have 2 things in common. They have an aperture of f2.8, and they all start at 16 millimeters. But what if there was another 16 millimeter lens with an even wider aperture and a much cheaper price that almost seemed too good to be true? It might be here. This is the new 16mm F1.8 from Sony. It costs $799, and I just feel like there must be something wrong with it.
So typically when I'm getting a lens like this in, I'm trying to figure out why you should actually buy it. Like, why would you want to spend money and get a lens like this? In this case, I'm trying to figure out why would you not want to get this lens? At least on paper, it's a must-have lens. Like, I own a 16-35 and a 12-24, and I still want to get this lens. It's that amazing.
Basically, there's almost no reason not to consider this lens unless it just sucks. And that's what we're gonna find out. So one thing I've been pretty much unable to find any fault with lately on Sony lenses is going to be their build. Like, somehow these are just incredibly small, they're super light, they still feel well built, and they're just loaded with features you just don't find on non-Sony lenses. This weighs at 300 grams, which is under 11 ounces. It's 3 inches long, which is just crazy for any wide angle prime. But this is an f1.8 aperture, which is a very wide aperture. It does have an 11 blade aperture as well, which is great. Dust and moisture resistance. You have up to 120 frames per second support with autofocus for those of you A9 III users out there. The front element doesn't protrude at all from the actual lens itself, so you can actually use front filters on this, another rare thing with wide angle lenses. It's 67 millimeters, which is much smaller than I actually expected this to be. And you get the massive hardware upgrades that Sony's been throwing at their lenses, which just really level them up. So for example, you have an aperture ring on here, which you don't have to use. It's just there if you want to physically control your aperture, but you can slide this to this A position right here. And now I can control it with my camera dials, or I can just slide it to the aperture I want if I want to physically control it there. Where I do find this useful is you can actually de-click this, and that allows for smooth aperture adjustments. So if I'm filming something live, like a wedding, I use this a lot with weddings, and I'm actually filming and I need to change my exposure, but I don't want to have those hard stops, I can actually just very slightly alter this and control my exposure that way, and then you don't have those hard 1/3 stop adjustments that if you were changing settings via the dial that you would have. Now you can also lock this aperture ring, so if you don't want to use it, it won't be accidentally adjusted for you. You also have a manual focus switch on this, and the lens also has that more linear manual focus. I think it actually is linear manual focus on it. It's still electronically controlled, but it's linear. And it has 2 of Sony's latest high-end XD linear motors. So it's fast, it's incredibly smooth, completely silent autofocus. And I think the hardware on this is just, it's literally perfect. Given the price of this lens, I don't think there is anything on it that you can really fault Sony on. Plus 16 millimeters on an APS-C camera, like the A6000 series, it comes out to 24 millimeters. I think this would be perfect on a camera like that, maybe the FX30. Or if you want just a small lens setup for a small camera like the A7C II or something like that, I think it's going to be a great lens for that as well. So a whole lot of application for this kind of hardware. Now, technically, if you were to move up from this to like my current lens of choice, which is the 16-35 f2.8 GM2, this is over $2,000. Now, this does get you 4 XD linear motors instead of 2, but think about how much more glass this has, and heavy glass to move around. It really needs those extra motors that this one doesn't. Plus, at 16 millimeters, even with an f1.8 lens, you just have so much depth of field that this is going to be easily enough for keeping this super high speed autofocus. And I haven't thrown anything at this that it hasn't responded well to. Now, all of these images were actually edited using my Lightroom preset collection, which you can check out below. I'll link it below. But if you've seen me edit at all, you've known that I also use this. This is part of the Logitech MX Creative Console, which I do have a full video on, which you should definitely check that out. But this is just a massive speed up to my workflow. And it also controls everything from like my LED lights in here in my office. It runs macros, and I just use it in so many ways beyond editing. So I want to show you how this works. So it's going to be this wireless style. It has 4 custom buttons and a scroll wheel that controls almost any function on your computer, including all of those sliders in Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. But it also comes with a fully customizable LCD keypad with 9 buttons that you can program and up to 15 pages for setting up shortcuts, macros, and whatever else you can dream up. And sure, you can rate images, rotate photos, and change exposure without ever touching your mouse. But I actually just programmed 1 button to launch Premiere, open my sound effects library, queued my Spotify playlist, turned up my monitor brightness, dimmed my Philips Hue lights, and created a custom folder library for my next project. And if you want even more features, there's actually a complete marketplace for that too. So check out the video in the top right to see my full breakdown of everything this can do, or you can pick up one today using the link in the description below. Now, there are 2 issues I've kind of discovered that we kind of have to deal with on this lens when it comes to image quality. The first is going to be that this is a fix-it-in-post lens. And what I mean by that is it just suffers from some really crazy distortion and some vignetting that if you don't apply correction to, it's almost an unusable lens. Now, correction on this is going to be automatically applied like when you're looking through the camera. It's also automatically applied to JPEG files and video. So it's only raw files where you're going to have a profile that has to be added in your software of choice. So make sure you have a profile set up for it, and then it'll be automatically applied. But honestly, like the Sony 16 through 25 is going to be just as bad. So I don't really have a big issue with it. The only lens that doesn't really deal with a whole lot of this is going to be the Sony 16 to 35 f2.8. So again, this is my main lens that I use, and it has almost no distortion for this. Now, flare is actually pretty well controlled for a cheap-ish lens. And it's crazy. So many of you guys called me out in my last video because I was talking about a camera that was $700 and I called it cheap. And a lot of you guys didn't like that. But we had a long talk about it in the comments because I maintain that $700 for a camera is a cheap camera. And we can talk about this one in the comments because I actually think $799 for a Sony wide-angle prime lens is also very cheap. So that's going to be the cost of this lens, and the image quality overall is going to be amazing. But yes, you will see some flare. It doesn't look particularly good, but just a little bit of loss in contrast. But honestly, it's not that bad. I think it's actually better than I expected it to be. It's definitely better than the 16 through 25 f2.8, which is the wide angle lens that you basically recommend today. And if you stop this down to f22, so if you want to get like sun stars and things like that, it actually looks really good. It's going to be a really solid lens for like landscapes and architecture and stuff like that. I also noticed that this lens is actually wider than my 16 through 35. So even if you have this lens right here, there's still going to be another advantage to this in addition to that wide aperture. Also, when you take a look at sharpness on this, so I'm actually going to, even when I compare this to the 16 to 35, I'm going to give the edge to the 16mm prime as well. It's going to be pretty typical for primes to be sharper than some zoom lenses, but given the price difference between these two, I wasn't sure if that would hold up. Basically, at f1.8, the center sharpness is good enough. I would have absolutely no issues using this indefinitely at that. Now, if you start to look in the corners, it does get a little bit muddy in the corners, but pretty much every time I would care about corner sharpness on a wide angle lens like this, I'd be shooting at least f5.6 to f11. So some loss in corner sharpness at f1.8 really isn't an issue to me. And if you stop this lens down to f2.8, I think it beats out lenses like the 16 through 25 and even the Sony 16 to 35 in some cases. So this is going to be a solid lens when it comes to detail and sharpness. And I was shooting this on the A7R5, which is super high resolution. and the most high resolution camera that Sony offers. So if you're shooting this with like, a 30 megapixel A7C II, you're not even going to notice sharpness as much. Now that second issue that I talked about with this lens, it's going to be bokeh. And the good news is this is a 16mm lens, and even shooting at 1.8, you just really have to be macro, like close up to the lens to really start to see a lot of blurry background type of stuff. But it does have some weird shapes going on, and it's not all of that smooth. So if this was a 50mm portrait lens, I'd say this would be a problem, but for a 16mm wide angle lens, it should be way less of an issue. But if you're trying to find a weakness of this lens, this is definitely going to be it. Now, there really isn't a whole lot of competition to this when it comes to actual prime lenses. So the main competition is going to be zoom lenses. So Sony's 16 to 25mm, the Sigma 16 through 28mm f2.8. These are going to be the closest like in price. And even the Sony is going to be way more expensive. This is going to give you over one stop more light, which is pretty big. And I honestly think that in most cases, the 16mm is going to be a better choice, especially because it beats out those other lenses with sharpness. The Sony, at least, still suffers with the distortion issue. Sigma, not as much on that one. So for the money, you're really getting an amazing lens, great overall image quality, high-end hardware, and the biggest weakness is going to be distortion and bokeh, which you really never see on a lens like this. But if you guys want a full comparison between this and some of the other zoom lenses, definitely let me know. I have tons of BTS over on IG, so definitely check that out as well from these shoots. Hit me up with any comments or questions that you guys have. And while you're there, it would just mean a whole lot to me if you could just go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe while you're there. It goes a long way into just helping me create videos. So hope you guys are doing amazing. I'll catch you in the next one.